by scratching the surface, you get a terrible shock. It's such a, well, it's a heinous crime. People are so shocked by what...
The state banquet was supposed to be perfect. Every smile had been measured, every seat had been chosen, and every silence carried the weight of royal discipline. But one brooch changed the entire evening. The moment Princess Catherine saw Queen Camilla wearing the jewel tied to Diana's most private memories, her expression shifted. Her glass lowered. Her voice stopped. Across the table, Camilla felt the change before anyone explained it, and Charles suddenly understood that the night had crossed into dangerous ground. What followed was not a small break in manners. It was a public rupture wrapped in silence. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Catherine did not look away. She kept her eyes on the brooch, and that stillness said more than any speech could have said. A state banquet is a formal dinner hosted by the monarch for important guests, designed to show unity, power, and national respect. That was why this moment mattered so deeply. The evening was not private. It was not casual. It was the kind of ceremony where every jewel, every gesture, and every pause could become a message. Charles sat under the pressure of that knowledge, while Camilla sat beside him wearing a symbol Catherine could not ignore. Camilla touched the brooch almost without thinking. Her fingers moved toward it, then froze, as if she had suddenly realized the jewel was no longer decoration. It had become evidence. Catherine recognized it as Diana's most loved piece, not because of its shine, but because of what it carried. Diana's memory was not distant to her. It lived in William, in his quiet pain, and in the children who had grown up hearing about the grandmother they never knew. That was why the sight struck so hard. It felt less like fashion and more like a wound being placed at the center of the table. Charles tried to hold the room together with his silence, but silence was exactly what had failed him before. The king looked toward Catherine, then toward Camilla, and the hesitation exposed the truth. He knew this was not only about one jewel. It was about who had the right to touch a memory still guarded by grief. Catherine's hand trembled beneath the table, and William saw it. The prince did not speak at first, but his eyes sharpened. He understood his wife's pain, and he understood the deeper insult hiding beneath the polished surface. Catherine finally raised one hand. A senior aide had begun moving toward the table, ready to soften the interruption, ready to turn pain back into protocol. But she stopped him without a word. The gesture was calm, controlled, and devastating. In that instant, Princess Catherine halted the state banquet, after noticing Camilla wearing Diana's most loved brooch. No one could pretend it was confusion. No one could call it a passing discomfort. The room knew exactly what had happened, because every face changed with it. Camilla stiffened. She had worn the brooch like authority, but now it seemed to weigh against her chest. The queen consort looked at Catherine with disbelief, then with anger, then with something closer to fear. She realized the room had not simply noticed the jewel, it had judged it. Catherine's silence became sharper than accusation, and Charles seemed trapped between the woman beside him and the family wound across the table. He could defend Camilla and deepen William's pain, or defend Diana's memory and leave his wife exposed before the room. William shifted in his chair, and that small movement carried the force of a warning. The future king saw what others were only beginning to understand. This was not about jewelry alone. It was about respect, memory, and the question no one wanted asked aloud. How far could the palace go in using Diana's legacy before the people who loved her finally refused to stay quiet? Catherine kept her posture steady, but her eyes had changed. The banquet had stopped, and now the real story was about to begin. But before the room could understand why Catherine had stopped the evening, every eye turned toward the people whose wounds made that brooch impossible to ignore. In that frozen banquet hall, the monarchy was no longer a polished institution. It became three people carrying three different versions of the same wound. Catherine stood as the guardian of Diana's memory. Camilla sat trapped beneath the weight of the jewel, and Charles looked like a man forced to watch two chapters of his life collide in front of the world. No one needed an announcement. No one needed a statement. The silence had already told everyone that something sacred had been crossed. Catherine kept her eyes on Camilla, and the pain in her face became impossible to hide. Her connection to Diana was not only through marriage. It was through William, through the children, and through the quiet duty of protecting the memory of a woman who still lived in the heart of the public. A future queen means the woman expected to stand beside the future king, and one day represent the monarchy's next chapter. That mattered, because Catherine was not just reacting as a wife. She was reacting as someone who understood how symbols shape trust. Camilla shifted in her chair, but she did not remove her hand from the brooch. The queen consort knew every jewel carried history, and this one carried more than beauty. A royal brooch is not simply an ornament. Inside palace life, it can become a sign of rank, memory, and belonging. That was why the choice felt so dangerous. Camilla's place had always been delicate, because every public appearance reminded people of the past she could never fully escape. She could wear the crown. She could sit beside Charles, but Diana's shadow still reached the table before her. Charles looked from one woman to the other, and the king's silence cut deeper than any answer. If he defended Camilla, he would wound Catherine and William. If he defended Catherine, he would expose his wife in front of the room. The monarch understood the trap because he had lived inside it for years. Diana's memory was not a closed chapter. It was a living force, and now it had returned through one glittering object pinned to Camilla's dress. William saw Catherine's face harden, and the prince moved before anyone else did. He pushed his chair back just an inch. Not enough to stand, not enough to create a scene, but enough to tell his wife that he was ready. The future king had spent his life carrying his mother's absence with quiet control, and now he watched Catherine carry that pain for him. His support did not need words. His movement said everything. Camilla leaned slightly toward Charles and whispered that the brooch had been approved. The queen consort spoke softly, but the words traveled through the tension like a spark. Approved. That word changed the air. Catherine heard it, and her expression became colder, not louder. Approval was paperwork. Approval was palace procedure. Approval was not respect. And in that moment, Catherine seemed to understand that the brooch had not appeared by mistake. Someone had allowed it. Someone had chosen not to stop it. Charles lowered his gaze, and the king looked defeated before anyone had accused him. He knew the difference between permission and peace. He knew that a palace decision could still be morally wrong. Camilla waited for him to speak, but he stayed silent, and that silence left her exposed. Catherine did not need to raise her voice. Her stillness had already become the accusation. Catherine finally spoke Camilla's name across the table, and the whole room tightened around the sound. The word was calm, but it landed like a verdict. William turned toward her, ready for whatever came next. Charles looked up too late. Camilla stopped breathing for a second. The shock was over now. The confrontation had begun, and the reason those words carried such force was hidden in a private incident the palace had tried desperately to bury. This moment did not begin at the banquet table. It began weeks earlier, behind closed doors, during a private jewel selection ceremony, where one decision quietly poisoned everything that followed. The palace believed the choice could be managed, softened, and hidden beneath protocol. But Catherine remembered the exact second the mistake was made, and by banquet night, silence was no longer possible. That memory followed her into the room like a warning. Catherine had walked into that earlier meeting expecting formality, not conflict. Camilla was already there beside Charles, calm and composed, while a senior royal dresser stood near the selected pieces. A jewel selection ceremony is a private palace process where royal jewels are chosen for a major public event. And it matters because those choices send messages before anyone speaks. For a state banquet, the decision carried even more weight, because the world would study every symbol. Charles knew this. Camilla knew this. Catherine knew it most of all. The brooch sat on the velvet tray among older pieces, but Catherine saw only one. Her face changed instantly, though she tried to hide it. Diana's cherished jewel was not just another object from a royal collection. It carried memory, motherhood, public love, and pain that had never fully left the family. Catherine understood why wearing it would wound William. She understood why their children would one day ask questions. And she understood why the public would see the choice as more than decoration. Catherine spoke quietly, but the words carried force. She asked that the brooch not be worn publicly by Camilla at the banquet. She did not accuse her. She did not raise her voice. She simply explained that the jewel was tied too deeply to Diana, and that seeing it on the Queen Consort would reopen memories William had spent years holding in silence. Catherine's request was not political. It was human. It came from a wife protecting her husband, and from a future queen protecting the emotional trust around the monarchy. Camilla smiled, and that smile became the sentence Catherine never forgot. The Queen Consort said the monarchy could not be ruled by old grief. The words were calm, almost soft, but they struck harder because of that calm. Catherine went still. Charles looked down. The king heard the sentence and understood at once how dangerous it was. Old grief. To Camilla, it sounded like history. To Catherine, it sounded like Diana had been reduced to an inconvenience. Charles had the power to stop it. The monarch could have said the brooch should remain untouched. He could have chosen peace before the wound became public. But he did not overrule Camilla. He let the silence stand between them, and that silence became the true point of no return. Catherine watched him avoid the decision, and in that instant, she learned something painful. The palace was not confused about the brooch. The palace was choosing comfort over care. Camilla personally chose Diana's brooch, despite Catherine's direct request that it remain away from the banquet. That was the trigger. That was the private moment everyone later looked back on as the first crack in the evening. The royal dresser saw Catherine's face tighten. Charles saw her step back from the tray. Camilla saw it too, but she did not change her decision. The room moved on as if the matter had been settled, but nothing had been settled. It had only been buried. Catherine carried that memory into the banquet, and the moment she saw the brooch pinned to Camilla, the truth became clear. The earlier conversation had not been misunderstood. It had been ignored. Charles's silence had allowed it. Camilla's choice had confirmed it. And Catherine's restraint finally broke into resolve. That realization turned the banquet from a ceremonial dinner into the confrontation the palace had spent weeks trying to avoid. There are moments when royal voices become sharper than any crown. Catherine did not shout. She did not make a scene in the ordinary sense. Instead, she spoke with the kind of calm that terrifies a room because everyone understands it has been earned through pain. Across the table, Camilla sat motionless, while Charles looked like he already knew what was coming. The banquet had paused, but the real break had only just begun. Catherine kept her voice low, and that made every word heavier. Guests remained seated, cutlery untouched, conversations dead before they could be rescued. Aides stood near the walls, unable to move without making the moment worse. Protocol means the formal rules of royal behavior, the quiet system that tells royals when to smile, when to speak, and when to stay silent. That mattered, because Catherine was expected to continue as if nothing had happened. But this time the rules were asking her to protect the image of unity while ignoring a wound placed in front of her. Camilla lifted her chin, but the Queen Consort could not hide the tension in her jaw. Catherine told her that some symbols cannot be borrowed without reopening the grief attached to them. The words landed cleanly. They were not cruel. They were worse than cruel. They were true. Charles watched Camilla stiffen, then watched Catherine refuse to soften. The king seemed to understand that his silence had helped create the moment now unfolding before him. Camilla answered with a hard whisper. The jewel belonged to the crown, not to memory. The crown is the monarchy as an institution, meaning the royal office and authority that continue beyond any one person. But Catherine did not accept that explanation, because Diana's brooch was not just part of a collection to her. It was tied to William's mother, to public grief, and to a history the palace had never fully healed. Camilla tried to make the jewel official. Catherine made it human again. Charles finally said Catherine's name, not as an order, not with the force of a monarch. He said it like a man asking the room not to fall apart. That single plea revealed how little control he had left. Camilla looked toward him, waiting for protection, but the king did not defend her. Catherine looked at him too, and her expression carried a deeper question. Why had he not stopped this before it reached the table? Catherine answered Camilla with a sentence that changed the air. Diana's name may not be printed on the place cards, but her presence is still in the room. The words cut through every polished excuse. Camilla's face tightened. Charles lowered his eyes. The guests understood then that the brooch had become more than jewelry. It had become a test of respect, and the palace had failed it in public. William rose halfway from his chair, and the movement told the room everything. The prince did not need to make a speech. He did not need to challenge Charles openly or accuse Camilla directly. His body had already chosen. He was with Catherine. He was with the memory of his mother. He was with the wound that the palace had tried to dress in diamonds and call tradition. Camilla saw him move, and for the first time that night, the queen consort looked truly shaken. Catherine did not step back. William remained ready beside her, and Charles looked trapped between past and future. The confrontation had begun as grief, but it was becoming something larger. It was becoming authority. It was becoming a line that could not be crossed again. And Camilla, still wearing the brooch, had failed to notice the quiet shift happening around her. Catherine's stand was not only emotional. Behind it was a quiet shift in power that Camilla had failed to measure. What made the banquet halt so dangerous was not simply Catherine's emotion. It was her authority. She was no longer only the grieving daughter-in-law protecting Diana's memory. She was the future queen, the woman increasingly trusted to guard the monarchy's moral language. And in that room, every courtier understood something had changed. Catherine had drawn a line the palace could not erase. Catherine stood steady, while the room waited for her to bend. She did not bend. Her influence had grown because people saw restraint in her, not ambition. They saw someone who could carry pain without turning it into chaos. A future queen means the woman expected to stand beside the future king and one day represent the next chapter of the monarchy. That mattered because Catherine's reaction was no longer being read as personal hurt alone. It was being read as judgment. William's quiet support made that judgment stronger. The prince did not need to dominate the room or challenge Charles loudly. He only had to remain near Catherine, and the meaning became clear. This was no longer one woman objecting to Camilla's choice. This was the future king's household refusing to let Diana's memory be folded into palace convenience. William knew the brooch carried his mother's shadow. He also knew Catherine had spoken because he had carried that shadow for too long. Charles felt the weight closing around him. The king looked toward Camilla, then toward his son, and every second made his silence heavier. He wanted the banquet to continue. He wanted the room to recover. But he also knew recovery would mean asking Catherine to swallow a pain she had already explained in private. That was the cruelty of the moment. Charles could keep the ceremony smooth only by making the wound deeper. Camilla understood it too late. The queen consort had expected discomfort, maybe even whispers, but not resistance this controlled. She realized Catherine was not simply offended. She was refusing to let Diana become a prop in a story rewritten for convenience. Camilla touched the brooch again, and this time the gesture looked less like pride and more like uncertainty. The jewel that was supposed to strengthen her position had trapped her in full view of everyone. A senior aide moved carefully toward Charles and leaned close with a whispered suggestion to resume dinner. The aide's role was to protect the flow of royal events, meaning to keep public ceremony from breaking under private pressure. But the king placed his hand flat on the table and gave no approval. That silent refusal mattered. It showed that even Charles understood the room could not be forced back into normal order. The damage was already visible. William turned to Catherine and spoke quietly. "You do not have to sit through this." The words were not dramatic, but they changed everything. The prince gave her permission to stop enduring what the palace had expected her to endure. Catherine heard him, and something in her settled. She was not alone. She was not being difficult. She was standing where grief and duty had finally met. Catherine stepped back from her chair. The sound carried through the room like a verdict. Camilla's face tightened. Charles looked down. William remained beside Catherine, calm but immovable. The banquet's suspension could no longer be hidden behind soft language or careful smiles. The first consequence arrived not through an announcement, but through the sound of Catherine's chair moving against the palace floor. The monarchy survives by making disruption look invisible. But that night, nothing could be hidden. Catherine's chair moved. William followed, and the carefully arranged banquet collapsed into whispers, stiff smiles, and terrified glances between aides. Camilla remained seated beneath the brooch's glittering weight, while Charles watched the future of his family walk away from a table he could no longer command. The silence did not protect him. It accused him. Catherine walked away with control, but the control was cracking. William stayed close to her, not touching too much, not speaking too fast, because he knew how deeply the moment had cut. The official dinner was paused, then quietly shortened. An official dinner means a formal royal meal, planned around guests, speeches, timing, and public meaning. That mattered, because ending it early was not a small change. It meant the palace had lost control of an event built to prove control. Camilla stayed seated for several seconds after Catherine left. The queen consort kept her hand on the brooch, as if removing it too quickly would admit guilt, and leaving it there would prove strength. But neither choice helped her. The jewel no longer looked powerful. It looked heavy. Charles saw that too. The king removed his glasses and set them beside his plate, and in that small movement, he seemed suddenly older. He had wanted peace, but peace had slipped away because he refused to make a decision when it mattered. Aides moved quickly, but their speed made the damage clearer. One palace aide tried to describe the halt as a private family matter, meaning an issue handled inside the royal household and not meant for public explanation. But the phrase could not survive what everyone had seen. Guests had watched Catherine leave. Guests had watched William follow. Guests had watched Camilla remain alone with Diana's brooch still pinned against her. No careful wording could turn that into nothing. William escorted Catherine into a side corridor, and only then did her expression break. The prince saw the pain she had held back at the table, and he understood why she had refused to continue. Catherine was not angry because Camilla had worn something beautiful. She was hurt because the warning had been given, ignored, and then displayed in front of the world. William spoke softly, but his voice carried the grief of a son. He knew this wound belonged to him too. Charles ordered quiet questions to begin at once. The king did not raise his voice, but his command moved through the household like a shock. A royal dresser was told to confirm who authorized the brooch. A royal dresser means the trusted staff member responsible for preparing clothing and jewels for major appearances. That mattered because the issue was no longer only emotional. If the brooch had been chosen against Catherine's request, then someone had allowed a private wound to become a public crisis. Camilla heard the order, and the queen consort's face changed. She knew the question would not end with a dresser. It would return to the private ceremony, to the velvet tray, to Catherine's warning, and to Charles's silence. The brooch had not simply appeared. It had passed through hands, through approval, through a decision no one wanted named. And now the palace machinery that usually protected her was beginning to expose the very choice she had made. Catherine reached the private sitting room before Camilla. William paused outside, giving her the space she needed, but he did not leave her alone in spirit. Charles remained behind, caught between the public room and the private reckoning waiting ahead. Camilla finally rose from the table, still wearing the brooch, and every step toward Catherine felt like a step toward judgment. And in that private room, away from guests and protocol, the night reached its most human and painful turning point. Away from the banquet hall, the monarchy's armor finally came off. There were no footmen, no advisors, no public smiles, and no official language left to hide behind. Catherine and Camilla faced each other as two women bound to the same royal story in painfully different ways. One carried Diana's memory like a duty. The other carried a crown that still could not silence the past. And for the first time that night, the pain had nowhere left to hide. Catherine waited in the private sitting room, with her composure barely holding. William stood outside the door, close enough to support her, far enough to let her speak for herself. A private sitting room is a smaller royal room used for personal meetings away from public ceremony. And that mattered because this conversation could no longer be protected by applause, guests, or protocol. Catherine had already stopped the banquet. Now she had to say why. Camilla entered alone. The queen consort had removed her gloves, but not the brooch, and that choice made the silence sharper. She looked at Catherine with anger still in her eyes, but the anger was thinner now. It had been weakened by the walk from the banquet hall, by the whispers behind her, and by the knowledge that Charles had not saved her from the moment. Camilla wanted to look wronged, but the jewel made that impossible. Catherine spoke first, and her voice was steady. She told Camilla the pain was not simply that she wore a jewel. The pain was that she wore it after being asked not to. That was the wound, not the glitter, not the history. The refusal. Catherine had made the request privately, respectfully, and clearly. Camilla had heard it. Camilla had understood it. And still, she had walked into the banquet, wearing Diana's brooch, as if Catherine's warning meant nothing. Camilla tried to answer, but the words did not come easily. The queen consort began with defense, saying the brooch belonged within the royal collection and had been cleared for use. A royal collection means the historic jewels, art, and objects held by the monarchy, often used in ceremonies to represent continuity. But Catherine shook her head, because continuity without compassion was not strength. It was carelessness. The monarchy could not claim to honor Diana while ignoring the people who still loved her most. Catherine then said what the whole night had been circling. Diana's memory could not be treated as palace property when it still lived inside William and his children. The words changed Camilla's face. Her anger faded into something more tired, more exposed. For years, the queen consort had tried to stand beyond Diana's shadow. But this moment proved the shadow had never disappeared. It had only waited for someone to misuse what it protected. Camilla looked down at the brooch, and for the first time, she seemed to feel its full weight. She slowly unpinned it. No speech, no victory, no apology dressed as performance. Just the quiet sound of surrender as the jewel left her dress and was placed on the small table between them. Catherine watched without triumph. She had not wanted to humiliate Camilla. She had wanted the boundary respected before the damage reached this point. William remained outside the door, but his presence was felt in every word Catherine had spoken. The prince's pain had shaped the room, even without him entering it. Catherine had defended Diana for him, for their children, and for the future they were expected to carry. Camilla understood that now. The queen consort had believed she was choosing a jewel. Instead, she had touched the one memory the future king's family would not allow the palace to rewrite. Charles entered moments later, and the king stopped when he saw the brooch lying between them. He did not need an explanation. Catherine's silence told him enough. Camilla's exhaustion told him more. The monarch understood, with painful clarity, that the verdict had already been reached before he arrived. The brooch had been removed. The boundary had been drawn. And by morning, what happened behind palace walls had become impossible for the world outside to ignore. The palace wanted silence, but the public received an image. By sunrise, Britain was no longer talking about diplomatic speeches, royal menus, or state ceremony. It was talking about one frozen moment: Catherine standing still, Camilla touching the brooch, and Charles caught between them. That single image traveled faster than any statement, turning a private wound into a national reckoning. The family had tried to contain grief. Instead, grief had stepped into the open. Catherine left the palace with William beside her, and the sight carried more force than any official words. The prince kept his hand protectively near her back, while she kept her eyes lowered and her face unreadable. A palace statement is a short official message released to explain or control a public event. That mattered because the statement said the banquet schedule had simply been adjusted, but the public had already seen too much. No careful sentence could erase Catherine's stillness, Camilla's hand on the brooch, or Charles's helpless silence. Camilla appeared the next morning without the brooch. The queen consort looked composed, but the strain around her face told another story. She had returned to duty, yet the missing jewel spoke louder than any answer she could have given. Public duty means the official appearances royals make to show stability and service. That mattered because Camilla was expected to look untouched by the scandal. Instead, her empty neckline confirmed that the brooch had become too dangerous to wear. Newspapers seized the moment with brutal speed. One front page showed a close crop of the jewel against Camilla's dress, under the headline, "The Jewel That Stopped the Crown." The image was simple, but it felt like a verdict. Broadcasters replayed the banquet pause again and again, framing it as a symbolic clash over Diana's legacy. Commentators spoke of jewels, memory, and power, but the public understood the heart of it without needing experts. Catherine had said no. Camilla had been forced to listen. William stayed silent in public, and that silence made his support even clearer. The future king did not give a speech. He did not feed the storm. But every image of him beside Catherine showed where he stood. His mother's memory was not a ceremonial object. It was family pain. It was childhood loss. It was the part of royal history no crown could polish clean. Catherine had defended that pain because William could not do so without reopening wounds the country still remembered. Outside Kensington Palace, a small crowd gathered with flowers and handwritten cards referencing Diana. Kensington Palace is a royal residence, closely linked to Diana's life and memory, which made the gathering feel deeply personal. People did not come because of protocol. They came because the brooch had awakened an old loyalty. Some cards thanked Catherine for protecting Diana's dignity. Others mentioned William and the children. The crowd turned private royal grief into public judgment, and the palace could no longer pretend the issue belonged only inside its walls. Charles watched the reaction harden through the day, and the king knew delay would make the damage worse. He had spent the night trying not to choose, but the public had chosen for him. Camilla could continue as queen consort, Catherine could continue as future queen, and William could continue in silence. But the brooch could not continue as if nothing had happened. It had become a symbol of carelessness. It had shown the monarchy what happens when old grief is treated like decoration. By evening, Charles made one final private decision. The brooch would be removed from future public use, unless Catherine and William agreed. The king did not announce it with drama, but the decision carried the weight of surrender. In the end, the banquet was not remembered for what was served, who attended, or what speeches were made. It was remembered because Catherine stopped pretending that every royal symbol can be polished clean of pain. She did what the palace rarely allows anyone to do. She gave memory a voice, gave grief a boundary, and forced the crown to admit that some jewels are heavier than gold. Charles made the order quietly, but the order carried final weight. The brooch would be returned to private royal custody and removed from future public use, unless Catherine approved it. Private royal custody means an item is kept under palace control, but no longer used openly for ceremonies or public appearances. That mattered because the jewel had stopped being decorative. It had become a wound the monarchy could no longer display. Charles understood that keeping it visible would only deepen the damage. Catherine accepted the decision without triumph. She did not smile. She did not treat it as a victory over Camilla. The future queen understood that the price had been too painful for celebration. Diana's memory had been protected, yes, but only after it had been placed in danger. That was why Catherine's sadness mattered. She had not fought to win attention. She had fought because someone had crossed a boundary that should never have needed defending. Camilla faced the cost of her choice in silence. The queen consort had believed wearing the brooch might show strength, continuity, and royal confidence. Instead, it had exposed distance. It had reminded the public of old wounds and reminded the family of private grief. Camilla understood now that the jewel had given her no power. It had only made the space around her colder. The thing meant to elevate her had left her more alone. William thanked Catherine in private, and the words came with more pain than relief. The prince did not thank her for defending an object. He thanked her for protecting the memory his family still carried. Diana was not just history to him. She was his mother. She was absence, love, and unfinished grief. Catherine had stood for that grief when the room expected her to stay quiet, and William knew what that courage had cost her. Charles stood alone before the returned jewel, and the king finally admitted what he had avoided all night. His silence had allowed the damage to happen. He had hoped the banquet would pass. He had hoped the brooch would be accepted as tradition. But tradition without compassion had become cruelty, and Catherine had forced him to see it. The crown is the authority and image of the monarchy. But that authority means nothing if it forgets the people still hurting beneath it. The palace quietly revised its internal guidance around Diana's personal jewels. Internal guidance means private rules used by royal staff to decide how sensitive items should be handled. That change mattered, because it acknowledged what Catherine had insisted from the start. Some objects carry emotional ownership, even when the palace controls them. William, Catherine, and their children were not protecting a possession. They were protecting a family memory from being turned into display. The final verdict was clear. Catherine's decision did not weaken the monarchy. It reminded the crown that dignity is not created by silence, and unity is not built by ignoring pain. Camilla learned that a crown cannot erase history. Charles learned that refusing to choose is still a choice. William learned that his mother's memory was not alone. And Catherine proved that the future of the monarchy would not survive by polishing wounds until they looked beautiful. The night ended with no grand speech, no public apology, and no triumphant display. Only a brooch locked away. Only a family forced to face its truth. Only Diana's memory protected from being worn as decoration again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.